You're listening to the Two Tongues Podcast. And now your hosts, Kyle and Chris.
Buongiorno. Welcome back, one and all, to another episode of the Two Tongues Podcast, where today I'm getting into some opinion scholarship. It's been a little while since I've been able to do this, so forgive me for the delay. You guys have been busy with other things going on. So Kyle and I have been able to do our normal show in a normal cadence, basically a normal cadence. But the opinion scholarship stuff that I like to do on my own, just been a little bit of a gap since the last one. But good news is we're rounding out our Gandalf the Red series, finishing up Carl Jung's Red Book. And this is going to be one of the last ones we'll do on it. There may be a handful more. I'm going to call this episode A Holy Affliction. And this is actually part 11 of the series. So I'll remind you, this is our longest running series so far. It just happens to be, what can I say? I love Carl Jung and his ideas. I do want to give you a quick reminder before I jump in that we are on part 11. So it's been a little while since we've got together on this topic. You might want a bit of a refresher. So I'll just remind you that the Red Book is strange. And I've said that many, many times. This is Carl Jung, who is a modern enough anyway, 20th century guy, pioneering psychologist, and made a lot of contributions to the field. He sort of invented this field that we call depth psychology and that kind of thing. But he was an interesting character. He did things that maybe wouldn't be orthodox in the scientific community, let's say. And so the process he went through when he wrote the Red Book, and I feel like I'm being a dead horse saying this each time we get together, but in case you've forgotten, he has a practice, a sort of meditative-like practice. I kind of like to describe it somewhere between a meditative practice and something like, what do they call that, where you're like awake inside your dream, lucid dream. So something like a combination of that, where he would get into contact with the unconscious within himself. And then he would harvest from those experiences knowledge, questions, but the way that he received them is very visual, which is very different from myself. I don't have a very particularly visual imagination, but Carl Jung did, and so the interactions he had with his unconscious took the form of stories, visions, and they read like visions, and they're very strange. And Jung talks about them in the Red Book as though he's communing with various parts of his unconscious, or the collective unconscious, which is an idea very much akin to God. We'll get to that in today's episode, but I do think that the origination of this idea of the collective unconscious is a way that Carl Jung can talk about God and try to remain sounding scientific or something like that. There definitely seems to be a tension with Carl Jung within himself about wanting to be a scientist, but the type of practice, the field that he's working in, isn't physical. It's a mental world. We're talking about psychology, and so it gets very weird. And without further ado, I just want to jump into this one. The first vision we're going to look at today is called the sacrificial murder. So I'm just going to call it the sacrificial murder. We're going to cover 3 visions today. I like to do these in threes. The first one, though, is going to be intense, and it's right on the heels of the last vision, which, if you remember, was Jung encountering this god, Izdubar, he called him. But there's this giant creature, like in stature, literally a giant creature that he encounters in his vision. And he's shiny and covered in gold armor. And he has got little bits of like gold flecks and like jewels and things in his beard. He looks like a dwarf, but like imagine a giant dwarf from Norse mythology, something like that. And he's just covered in all these symbols, the things he's holding and wearing and the things he says. They just represent this sort of just generalized or abstract mythological motif. This Izdubar character represents God. Okay. And he has this encounter with Izdubar, and it's all very interesting. But essentially what happens is Izdubar is dying, and Jung has to find a way to save him. And the way this story unfolds, what you notice is that Jung and Eisdebar really are not unique creatures. They're actually one being. So this encounter that Jung has with God and his vision is actually an encounter with his self in some way. And so it gets very, very strange. And so this is what's leading up to this. The Jung, he cures the dying God, but in a sense, he's given birth, right? It's almost like a rebirth situation. He's given birth to this renewed God, and it happened through him. Like he was the incubator. His own consciousness was the incubator. And so there's a connection between consciousness and the divine, and he's just sort of skirting around this idea, and we're going to get into it here. So again, we're going to open up with the sacrificial murder. When I do these guys, I like to, rather than just read everything verbatim to you, I like to summarize what I can. So I'm going to open it up, just kind of setting the scene a little bit. So the scene opens with this vision. He calls it a dreary valley. He says, in this dreary valley where, quote, the air smells of crime, of foul, cowardly deeds. Okay, so this is supposed to elicit some memories in you and some emotions in you, but this is where we're opening the scene, in a dreary valley where the air smells of crime, of foul, cowardly deeds. Jung comes upon, the first thing he comes upon is a dirtied, mangled marionette. Right? It's like a child's toy, a marionette, and it's broken and strewn across the ground, and it's lying in pieces. So he notices this and he keeps walking, and the next thing he sees is actually the mangled body of a small girl, of a child. And she is the mirror of the marionette. Looks just like the marionette. I called it, when I read it, I called it a Pinocchian nightmare. It's almost like the doll that he just saw had come to life, and it was granted life only to have it violently snuffed out. So you have this, she's covered in wounds. Her head is smashed open, just the way that the marionette's head was smashed open. So you get this. This is what you see. A dreary valley smelling of crime and cowardly deeds, and then you come across, this broken toy, and then this mangled body. And of course, Jung does what anybody would do in that situation. He stands there in horror, right? He doesn't know what to do or what to say. And then it shifts and then we'll go to the actual book here, and it begins like this. A shrouded figure like that of a woman appears, standing calmly next to the child. Her face is covered by an impenetrable veil. Okay, and so this woman and Jung start to speak. And she says, step nearer, and you will see that the body of the child has been cut open. Take out the liver. So now she's like, pull the liver out of this dead child's body. And Jung, of course, he reacts horrified, and he refuses, and she insists, and he refuses. And she says, I want you to remove the liver. You must do it. So now she's getting forceful. And he says, who are you to give me such an order? And she responds, I am the soul of this child. You must do it for my sake. So, right. So this is how the vision, right? This is how they work. So this woman has appeared out of nowhere, standing next to the dead child, and covered in a veil. And then she admits that she is the soul of the child. And now she's demanding that he remove the child's liver. But now it's clear to Jung that it's the child's own soul asking. And the first thing that I want to point out here is when she says, you must do this for my sake. I don't know what that reminds you of, but it brings to my mind immediately a parallel from the New Testament, where Jesus is talking about the communion, essentially, and he says, do this in remembrance of me. Do this for my sake. Something like that. And I want you to keep your ears perked, because we're going to have a lot of biblical references and parallels, or Christian references and parallels, in these visions that we haven't seen before, or certainly not as much of, or not as clearly and directly. So this is the first one. So she says, I am the soul of this child. You must do it. And Jung begrudgingly complies. He reaches down, he cuts her liver free from her body, and then he asks her, what is he supposed to do with it, right? And she says, take a piece of the liver in place of the whole and eat it. And again, Jung objects violently. He says, This is desecration, necrophilia. You make me a guilty party to the most hideous of all crimes. Okay. So he reacts as you would expect. But again, keep your ears perked, because what's happening here? He's being asked to eat the liver of this dead child. And it doesn't take much to go from this first, like biblical reference or reference from Jesus, to one that sounds starting to sound a lot like communion, right? Eating of flesh. That's part of communion. So you see this happening here, something like that. And I want to point out that the eating of flesh, I mean, this whole cannibalism as a ritual is something that we know exists kind of cross culturally. Obviously, it's mostly an ancient ritual. It's not something that's done much anymore these days. There may be some few exceptions to that, but I remember an example learning about this maybe I was like 18 or 19. I learned about a tribe called the South Foray. This is a tribe in Papua New Guinea, and one of their rituals is when a matriarch of the tribe dies. Imagine a grandma, and she's had lots of children, right? When she dies, her uterus is removed, and it's ritually consumed by all of the young women in the tribe. And so you can see the reasoning behind that. It's like this matriarch who was very fertile and was a blessing to the tribe and had lots of children for us. Well, if we eat her uterus, then maybe that fecundity will be passed to the other women. So I only point this out I want to give you kind of a primitive, I don't know if that's an appropriate word, but I said it already, let's go with it, a primitive version of ritual cannibalism. One that might be home in any sort of ancient tribal society that you might come across. But then contrast that to the Christian communion, which is the spirit of the Christian communion is not dissimilar from what I just described to you from Papua New Guinea. The idea is to consume God, right? And by consuming God, bringing God into you, right? There's a physical way in which you're right. There's transubstantiation, right? The bread becomes God's body, and you bring it into yourself. And we know what happens when we eat food is we incorporate those things into our body. It becomes our new cells and all of that, the energy we use to exist. And so bringing God into ourselves and absorbing that or something like that. Very much like what we see from Papua New Guinea. So I just want to set the stage that this is a very broad, kind of common, or not at least not uncommon, ritual, and then the process of understanding what's happening. It's not that different. All right, let me continue. All right, so the soul of the girl, she's standing there. She says, "There is only one atonement. Abase yourself and eat." So she's asking Jung to abase herself. Now she's talking about there only being one atonement. And again, you should have bells ringing all over in terms of Christian parallels. There's only one atonement for sins, and that's the blood of Christ according to the Christian tradition. And you have that same language here. But she asks him to do something strange, right? She says, abase yourself, right? She's asking him to eat this dead child's liver, and he doesn't want to. And so when she says abase yourself and eat, what does that mean? Abase yourself. Like it means something like to make yourself low, to humble yourself. It might have some more negative connotations than that exactly, but you get the gist. To humble yourself, to make yourself low. So he's going to basically get off his high horse and eat the damn liver. He's going to get over his his rejection, and he's going to do as he's told. Now, I bring this up because he's being asked to lower himself. And Jung has a kind of a famous quote. You'll see it if you look up any Carl Jung quotes. And I learned it initially from Jordan Peterson, actually, where Jung says, modern man can't see God because he doesn't look low enough. Right? So we think about God as this perfect, paramour. We think about God as this transcendent thing. And he's saying, well, this is the reason that modern man never finds God. And this is the reason why atheism is, rampant in modern society, is because people have this presumption that they're going to find God way up here somewhere. And then, in fact, if you want to find him, you need to look much closer to home. You need to look low enough. And the soul here is asking him to abase himself, to become low. So I want to make a connection here between what the soul of this girl is asking him to do and what Carl Jung says, long after the Red Book, the stuff he wrote in the Red Book about modern man not being able to see God because he doesn't look low enough. There's a connection here between what his soul is telling him to do and the advice that he gives, to the public later on. All right, Jung says, "So shall it be for your sake, as you are the soul of this child. I kneel down on the stone, cut off a piece of the liver, and put it in my mouth. My gorge rises, tears burst from my eyes. Cold sweat covers my brow, a dull, sweet taste of blood. I swallow with desperate efforts. It is impossible. Once again and once again, I almost faint. It is done. The horror has been accomplished." All right, so I left all that in because I wanted you to see the struggle that he's describing the struggle. He can barely bring himself to do it. And even so, like his body won't let him swallow. And he tries and tries and tries. And after a great effort, he says, the horror has been accomplished. And she immediately says, "I thank you." And she throws back her veil and reveals that she's a beautiful maiden with ginger hair. Okay, now the next line is going to give it away, so I'm just going to stop here for a second and say, do you remember in the prior visions when this woman with ginger hair appears? Because she appears over and over. And what we're told prior to this vision, obviously, we're told what she is and what she means, and we're getting ready to have that unveiled as well. She says, "Do you recognize me? I am your soul." Okay, so this is what the recurring image of this red-headed woman in these visions represents. It represents Carl Jung's own soul. So he's having here an encounter with his own soul. Now, interestingly, if you picked up on it, which I'm sure you did, she said to Jung that she was the soul of the dead child. And now she's revealing herself to be Jung's own soul. So she's both the soul of this dead child in his vision. Now, granted, she's not a real child. She's in his vision, but he's her soul and Carl Jung's soul. So I'm thinking about this. This is obviously important. What does it mean that the veiled woman is both Jung's soul and the soul of the dead child? Is it a metaphor for the death of the child in Jung? Like his inner child? Right? That's a psychological idea, appropriate. Or maybe it's his anima, right? This is a Jungian idea. This is the idea of the feminine aspect of the masculine person, of the man. He subdues the feminine impulses and the feminine instincts within him in order to become a man. And so he has this lingering, repressed spirit in him called the anima. It's, all of the femaleness in him that he's suppressing in order to be masculine. And of course, Jung gives the opposite to women and calls that the animus. But in this case, the dead child could be Jung's inner child, or maybe it's his anima. Maybe it's something like that. And the anima or animus is a symbol of transformation to Carl Jung. It has to do with, I don't know if the word enlightenment comes to mind, but it's not exactly the right word. There's another word I'm thinking of that's not coming to me. But in any case, the psychological transformations to Carl Jung are leading in a direction. And that direction he calls wholeness, like psychological wholeness. But that means something more than just being healthy, like having a healthy psyche. It means something spiritual. It means something deep to Carl Jung. To be whole or to achieve wholeness is like, it's something like to become one with God. It's like the ultimate thing. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what this is, what this means, but these are some possibilities. Okay. I'm also reminded of a verse from the New Testament in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. You've probably heard of it, where it goes something like this. "When I was a child, I understood as a child. I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put childish things away." And the reason this comes to mind is because Jung seems to have struggled with the idea that spirit was childish. Like like he should have outgrown the idea of even believing in it in spirit, but he never did. He never grew out of it. And so maybe he sees his soul as a child for that reason. This is the bias of the modern scientific paradigm, which Jung desperately wants to be accepted by the way. And yet he remains unwilling to throw childish things away, because deep down he has an intuition that spirit is actually of paramount importance. Now, I think, and I said before, that Jung adapted the word unconscious as a kind of a scientifically acceptable way of speaking about something that isn't, about speaking about the psyche. But of course, that's the Greek word for it. But the mind is something divine. Okay, the Greeks would use the word nous, like the Plato and the Platonic philosophers would use the word nous to talk about mind as divine, or consciousness. In the same way, they would call that logos, spirit, right? The divine. Now, this view aligns with him consuming her liver, as if he's trying to reintegrate the child back into himself, like to resorb that long abandoned archetype towards wholeness, to reintegrate the soul, to resurrect it by embodying it, by making it a part of his own body, right? To consume it. And as I mentioned before, this is one of the oldest attested religious beliefs ever, full stop. This idea of ritual cannibalism. In fact, the oldest religious text, or at least one of the oldest that we know about or have access to, are what they're called the pyramid texts. These are ancient Egyptian texts that were written inside of tombs, on walls, and inside of pyramid, like coffin lids and things like that. And one comes to mind. It's called the Cannibal Hymn. It wasn't called the Cannibal Hymn then in ancient Egypt, but it's become called the Cannibal Hymn. It dates back to about 2300 BC. And in the Cannibal Hymn, it says, it's talking about a deceased pharaoh, but it refers to him as the bull of heaven. And this has other mythological connotations, but let me just read it to you. It says, the bull of heaven decided to live on the being of every god, who ate their entrails, who eats their magic and swallows their spirits. So you can see here a very, very ancient connection to the communion, to the modern Christian communion. An ancient Egyptian idea of ritual cannibalism, of eating and bringing the spirits and bringing the gods into himself. It goes on, it says, the sacrifice has been accomplished. The divine child, the image of the god's formation, is slain, and I have eaten from the sacrificial flesh. The child enclosed all the primordial and elemental powers that God needs for his genesis. We must regenerate ourselves, but the restoration of our human life signifies an act of the below. All right, so I know that's a lot. Let me unpack for you a little bit. So he's talking about, of course, the dead child, eating of her flesh and all that, but he's talking about her as the image of the god's formation, which is related to the prior visions about him, kind of the rebirth of Izdubar and bringing this god back, back from the dead, bringing it back into existence through himself. So we'll get there. So he's eating her flesh, and by eating her flesh, he is incorporating into himself what? All the primordial and elemental powers that God needs for his genesis. So he's bringing the power, everything that's needed to give birth to God into himself by eating this. Okay, so this theme continues. Then the important bit here really is the end, where he says, we must regenerate ourselves, but the restoration of our human life signifies an act of the below. Okay, so I want to point out here, when he says the restoration of our human life, without explaining it, it implies something that's not explained, and I want to be clear about it. To restore your human life implies that you have some other kind of life, that the human one now needs to be restored. So we'll get there, but I just want to plant that seed. And he says the restoration of your human life signifies an act of the below. An act of the below. What does that sound like to you? It sounds like an act of the devil, an act of hell, something like that, of the below, of the lower things. So Jung is saying that we have to separate ourselves from God. We must think of ourselves as external to God. If we desire to be unified with it, with God, we must become distinct from it. So this is a paradox, but stick with me here. Paradoxically, to be near to God, we must first be far from it. Okay, this is what he means by restoring our human life. This is the act of dissociating from the divine unity, of becoming a subject in order to discover God. So the other life, beyond our human life, is actually the divine life. So we have to separate ourselves from the divine unity. We are, let's just say there's only God. God is all that exists. So we separate ourselves from God to become a thing of our own. And this is what he's talking about when he says, restore your human life. It's to come out of the divine unity and become yourself again. And why do you do that? In order to discover God. Okay, this is an act of the below because distance from God or from unity is something like what we mean when we say words like evil or sin. And in some respects, it's an act of evil to separate your being from the divine being, right? To pull away from God, so to speak. How can that be good? Now, St. Augustine of Hippo, so an early Christian, goes back to the 400s AD, he defined evil as distance from God. Now, he said evil is not a thing of itself, but merely the absence of good. So you can see what I mean, distance from God being something evil, but we're saying here that it's necessary. Somehow it's necessary. So I want to point out here that union with God begins with a sin, sort of, if we can put it that way. To separate yourself from God is like the necessary first step to be able to recognize God. Because as long as you're one with him, like where's God, right? It's not out there, it's in here. So you have to separate yourself from that unity so you can look back at the thing that you're not and say, there's God. It's a prerequisite for an encounter with God. And so you have something like a sin that's necessary for this. Requires it. And I can't help but parallel or think about the parallel of the fall of man from the book of Genesis. And the fall, of course, was necessary, just like we're being told this is necessary for the redemption of humanity and Christianity. All right, it continues, it says, by eating from the bloody sacrificial flesh, he testifies that he is a man, that he recognizes good as well as evil. And he destroys the image of the God's formation through withdrawing his life force, with which he dissociates himself from the God. This occurs for the salvation of the soul, which is the mother of the divine child. Whew, man, goosebumps, baby. Okay, so he says, by eating the sacrificial flesh, he testifies that he's a man and that he recognizes good and evil. So I have to, again, point out a clear parallel here. This phrase, recognizes good and evil, it comes directly from the book of Genesis, from the story of the fall of man, but primarily about the tree of knowledge. The knowledge of what? Of good and evil. Okay, so in that Genesis story, God exists in the garden with Adam and Eve, right, in paradise. They walk together. They're close. It's an image of unity. It's in story form, you might say, but that's what the story is telling us. So we're linking this here to the Genesis story. And he says, and he destroys the image of the God's formation through withdrawing his life force, with which he dissociates himself from the God. So by withdrawing imagine again, the unity, God is everything. By pulling yourself out of that unity, by dissociating from that unity, you can now encounter God because you're now other from God. So this is what he's talking about. So you're pulling your life force out of that unity to become something standing independently on your own, outside of and in contrast to God itself. And he says that occurs for the salvation of the soul, right? There's a fall required for salvation. This is true in the Genesis story. This is true in the vision from Jung. And he says that is the mother of the divine child. So another connection to this rebirth of the God from the prior vision, something that Jung did never realize that was in him or that he was capable of. So I don't know what you think here, but eating the sacrificial flesh brings to mind not just Christian communion, but eating the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, doesn't it? It was the eating of the fruit that dissociated God from man, right? It separated them so that they no longer walked together. That's what the book of Genesis says. And man was now frightened by God, shamed, right? Now, before the break, before this fall, they didn't know good and evil because they were one in God, right? In wholeness, in the unity where all is one, including good and evil. So by withdrawing his life force from the unity, he claims an identity of his own. But now it stands outside of and in opposition to the wholeness, to God. He's the other now. So he's no longer one, so he sees the one outside of himself. This is another psychological idea, what they call it projection, right? So you see the one outside of yourself as infinite sets of opposing forces. There's lots of language in here, paradoxical language. You see it very, very commonly in mysticism. I always like to point it out that the closer we get to speaking about God, the closer we get to speaking about something true about God, we start getting into descriptions of opposites, of opposing forces. Those are, you would call them relative, right? Good, evil, up, down, that kind of thing. And Jung says that it occurs for the salvation of the soul, which is the mother of the divine child. Now, that means that the act of dissociating from God is necessary for us to recognize God in ourselves. So it's a prerequisite for ultimate self-knowing. And that's maybe closer to the idea of wholeness that Jung might provide. It goes on, it says, if the soul dips into radiance, she becomes as remorseless as the God himself. Since the life of the divine child which you have eaten will feel like glowing coals in you. It will burn inside you like a terrible, inexhaustible fire. You cannot let it be, since it will not let you be. From this you will understand that your God is alive. You feel that fire of the sun has erupted in you. Something new has been added to you. A holy affliction. Fuck, man, hair standing up my arms. So when he says, if the soul dips into radiance, she becomes as remorseless as God himself. So this is the idea of the unity, of this sort of transcendent idea. If the soul dips into radiance, like if the soul becomes unified with God and blends into that cosmic unity, that your soul will become as remorseless as God. And you have to imagine that God is something. I'm afraid I'm going to get too far off the path if I go too far. So let me just pump the brakes. But then all this language here about after you eat the flesh and the power is in you, and God is in you, he says it will feel like coals. It will burn inside you like an inexhaustible fire that you can't let be because it won't let you be. You start to see this sort of transfer of like who's in charge in here, right? Like, I've eaten the God, consumed it, and now there's almost like a battle between, well, who's in there? Is it me? Am I in charge, or is it God in charge? That's the feeling I get when I read that. You can't let it be because it won't let you be. And he said, and this is how you understand that God is alive, because you feel it like the fire of the sun erupting in you, right? God is alive in you, right? We are the living. We are the thing that is alive. So for God to be alive, it must be in us. It must be participating in life. Okay, and he calls this a holy affliction. It's interesting, like to be touched by God, to have that divine knowledge, to carry that with you, for it to be unshakable, is a holy affliction. Again, another paradoxical sort of contrast, holy affliction. You see what I mean? When I say the closer we get to talking about truth about God, we run into paradox. Holy affliction, I think, counts as a paradox. He goes on and says, sometimes you no longer recognize yourself. You want to overcome it, but it overcomes you. You want to set limits, but it compels you to keep going. You want to elude it, but it comes with you. You want to employ it, but you are its tool. You want to think about it, but your thoughts obey it. There is no escape. So it is that you come to know what a real God is. The God wants my life. He wants to go with me, sit at the table with me, work with me. Above all, he wants to be ever present. So kind of more of that holy affliction feel, right? It's more of this, you've taken the God into yourself, and now you have this conflict where who's who? Who am I? Am I God? Am I myself? You have this internal conflict. And I think it's very interesting. So we give God life. We bring it into reality. So we give God reality, right? Not only do we give God life, we give it reality. By that, I mean existing in the way that we do. And how do we do that? By bringing God into ourselves, right? We allow ourselves to be possessed by God, right? This is what Jesus called, or the Orthodox Church calls kenosis. They talk about Jesus's behavior towards God, to empty himself so that he can be filled by God. So there's no longer Jesus there. There's no longer a person. There's just a body being operated essentially by God, by the Spirit of God, and not an individual anymore. And so there's something like this is going on here. We bring life and reality to God by bringing God into life and in reality, into life and into reality. That's what we are. We're a living being in reality. So we bring God into that. Okay, this is the reverse of our creation, by the way, which was brought into existence within God. The message is that of a mutual counterdependence between God and the world, between creator and creation. This is why Jesus practices kenosis and prayed that mankind will become one with God. To empty ourselves is to discover that the ego, the thing that we think we are, ain't behind the wheel. It just pretends to be. The life in us is actually God itself. God gives birth to being and to us so that we can give birth to it within us. So there's a mutual counterdependence between creator and creation, between us and God. That brings me to the next vision. The next two visions are interesting. They follow the same pattern. It's almost like they're versions of those choose your own adventure books. If you ever read any of those when you were a kid, where you could, if you make this decision, you go to page 12. If you make the other decision, you go to page 46. It's something like this with the next two visions, but they're briefer and they're not quite as heavy. So let me just power through them. This one's called Divine Folly. And I'll just set the scene. It opens up with Jung passing between a green curtain into a tall ceiling, empty room, with nothing in the room but two doors, one on the right, one on the left. And Jung has to choose which door. So he opens the one on the right, and he finds himself in a library, in a well-stocked library. And he remarks, quote, "The atmosphere is troubling. Scholarly ambitions, scholarly conceit, wounded scholarly vanity." So he spots the room's only inhabitant, which in the distance is a tall, pale, presumably librarian, and he goes up and he asks him. He goes, engages with him, and the librarian asks him what he wants, and Jung answers. He says he wants a book by a guy named Thomas à Kempis called "The Imitation of Christ." And the librarian's incredulous, cannot believe that he's just been asked for this particular book. And so he's surprised. And he says, it seems like he doesn't know why anybody would have asked for it. And the impression you're left with is that he's kind of turning his nose up at the religious nature of the book. He's like, oh, you're one of those people. So this is an illustration again of this tension in Jung between the spiritual world and the religious world and the scientific one on the other side. Like he wants to be accepted in both. He wants to exist in both. And so this vision here is one of the scholarly side, one potential path that Jung might have taken in his life. And this is the academic path. And while he's there, what he's asking for is not an academic book. He's asking for a religious book. And of course, the librarian, the academic, is turning his nose up. So this is all representative of what the kind of struggle going on within Jung. So I want to make that obvious. Okay, so the librarian doesn't know why he's asking for the book. He basically, why is a modern man interested in these sort of superstitious things? That's kind of the gist. And so it kind of opens. Jung says, "You know that I value science extraordinarily highly, but there are moments in life where science also leaves us empty and sick. In such moments, a book like Thomas's means very much to me, since it's written from the soul." And if you don't know, Kempis's book surrounds kind of a meditative path within Christianity, like an inner spiritual path. So this is what the book is about. And the librarian says, "But somewhat old-fashioned. Can we no longer get involved in Christian dogmatics these days? Surely." So you see he's turning his nose up. He's like, surely you can't be interested in Christian dogma. Jung says, "We haven't come to an end with Christianity by simply putting it aside," which I find to be very interesting. I find that to be striking, like this is an important thing for me personally to hear. We haven't come to an end with Christianity by simply putting it aside. Okay, now we have this little refrain, which is not a part of the conversation between Jung and the librarian. It's like his inner voice. And it says, "We fought against Christ. We deposed him, and we seemed to be conquerors. But he remained in us and mastered us. Christ is the way. You can certainly run away, but then you are no longer on the way. The way of Christ ends on the cross. Hence, we are crucified with him in ourselves. With him we wait until we die for our resurrection." It goes on. "If I imitate Christ, he is always ahead of me, and I can never reach the goal unless I reach it in him. And thus I move beyond myself and beyond time, in and through which I am as I am. But if I am truly to understand Christ, I must realize how Christ actually lived, only his own life, and imitated no one. If I thus truly imitate Christ, I do not imitate anyone, but go on my own way, and I will no longer call myself a Christian. The true way does not lead upward, but towards the depths, since only my other leads me beyond myself. But acceptance of the other means a descent into the opposite." That's how this vision ends. But holy crap. So powerful stuff. Okay. The line here that hits me, and probably you too, is where he says that I'll go my own way and no longer call myself a Christian. I don't think that's like a rejection of Christianity by any means, or even of religion. I think what he's saying here is very clear. He said, if he's to imitate Christ, he has to look at how Christ lived, and Christ didn't imitate anyone. So if he wants to imitate Christ, he has to not imitate anyone. He has to go his own path. And this is what he says, that path leads towards the depths. And this is a recurring theme in Jung's ideas. When he says depths, when he's looking for God, not in heaven, but in his own depths, there's a connection between the divine and consciousness. And so where Jung needs to find wholeness, where he needs to find God, is within himself. It's so deep within himself, it's a place that he has no access to. This is where that idea of unconscious comes from, or the collective unconscious. But he calls it my other. He says, my other leads me beyond myself, okay? So this is the idea that as a human being, we are two things simultaneously. We are transcendent and immanent. We are creator and creation. We are exactly who we think ourselves to be. We're a mortal being. We're going to die. We're made of cosmic dust. All of that is true. We have an ego, We have a name and the sound of our voice and the ideas and the preferences that we have that we bundle up together in some weird way that we call our identity or our self, that we attach ourselves to this thing. And then all that is true. That's your human life, as he said. But there's another component to you, a deep one that you can only find in the depths. It's the one that connects you to everything, that cosmic unity that we call God. Okay, that's the unconscious. So we're simultaneously two things. We're conscious and we're unconscious. We're an individual and we're God itself. This is what he's saying. And he says, accepting that other part, that other, the other self, the part of us that is God, accepting that that is true is what he calls a descent into the opposite. This is the mythological descent into the underworld, right? The underworld is that place where spirit is. It's the place where God is, the divine realm, the other half of reality, that sort of thing. And of course, this shows up in the Christian story as well. The harrowing of hell is what they usually call that. But when Jesus dies on the cross, he doesn't resurrect for 3 days. What is he doing in that time? Well, he descends into hell. Okay. This is a mythological motif that goes back to, ancient Greece. It goes back to, ancient Samaria, for that matter, with characters like the Egyptian Osiris or, Persephone, the Orphic story, all of this stuff. And that brings me to the last vision for today, which is called Nox Quarta, the fourth night. And I'll set the stage. All right, this vision picks up in the same anteroom we were just in, with the green curtain where the prior vision began, as if the scene reset. Okay, but this time, when Jung has to select the door, he chooses the one on the left. And when he enters, he finds himself not in a library, but in an insane asylum. No one believes that he's sane, by the way, while he's there. That's the worst part. He finds himself in an asylum and he can't convince anybody he's not crazy, a nightmare by any measure. But it's because all of his talk about religion, right? It's his emphasis on religion and spirit. Well, he would call it psyche, but spirit. This is the reason that everyone thinks he's crazy. It's because his interest is in religion. So we had this snarky, resistance to his interest in spirit coming from the librarian, like dismissive and snarky. But on the other side here, instead of being that way, it's like, oh, you're being superstitious and childish. Now it's, you're nuts. You're absolutely nuts. So that's what he's dealing with. And it soon becomes clear that the words and ideas of deeply religious people are very hard to distinguish from the mad. Okay, I'm thinking about my precious 90-year-old grandmother. The older she gets, she talks, she prays, but now she does it out loud. So you'll just be you'll walk by her, walk by grandma, and she's in the middle of a conversation that she's having out loud with God, right? That's what I mean. It's difficult to distinguish a deeply religious person from one that is insane. You see visions, you hear voices, that sort of thing. You know what I mean? And Jung experiences a vision of his soul again. But this one is way more abstract and strange, much more psychedelic, if you ask me. It takes the form of a mystical tree whose roots descend into hell and its branches reach up into heaven. So this is a Jacob's ladder, axis mundi kind of thing. And he recognizes in it the symbol of the cosmic tree. This is the axis mundi. This is one of the most common mythological motifs in the world. This idea of a place that is the center of the cosmos, and it's usually a pole or a tree or something like that, often connecting the realms of heaven and earth, that kind of thing. And he knows it represents opposites in unity, right? The above and the below is the thing that connects them. So opposites in union, we have this paradoxical idea again. But he struggles to believe that it's his soul. He rejects it intuitively because, and here's the ticket, man, unlike the pure heavenly above, the below represents things like chaos and evil, right? the above and the below. It's opposite of the above. The above is everything grand and holy and pure. The below is everything contaminated and low, right? And what did Carl Jung say about this? Remember, the modern man doesn't find God because he doesn't look low enough. This is the rejection. This is the same thing that's happening. He rejects this intuitively. He's okay with associating himself with the above, with all the good stuff, but he rejects the below, right? He knows the vision is telling him to accept this of his soul, but he rejects the below. He doesn't wish to be or incorporate evil, right? He wishes to be free of that. He wants to be holy. And maybe he doesn't quite understand what that means, really understand what that means. All right, so he begins like this. If you return to primal chaos, you will notice that you can no longer separate good and evil. You thus forget the distinction as long as your tree grows from below to above. All right. If you return to primal chaos, first of all, chaos is the thing that is there in the beginning of our mythological stories, right? The abyss, the watery abyss from which God creates, or the chaos, literally in the Greek myths of Hesiod. Chaos is the first deity, and the Egyptian have a similar character they call Nun. This kind of thing. So to return to primal chaos means to return to that divine unity, to return to God. And when you return to God, he says, you will notice you can no longer separate good and evil. So we're talking here this whole time about kind of a necessity of a sin or evil or a fall in order to get to salvation. It's like a prerequisite. And we're struggling, trying to understand what that means. And he reminds us that if we were God, we wouldn't recognize a distinction between good and evil, right? Because everything is together. Everything is one. If good and evil are together, how can you distinguish them? You can't. So this is the idea that in the cosmic unity, there isn't morality in the way that we think about it. There isn't distinction in the way we know it in the world. Nothing is relative in the divine. It's all a oneness, a unity. So the act, the fall or the sin or the evil, the thing that we think is bad, that's necessary for the thing that's good, the salvation that's coming, in the perspective of God, within that unity, there's no distinction between the sin or the fall being bad or good. So that's the point that I want to make. And he's saying this is true so long as your tree grows from below to above. He goes on, he says, he who wants to accept himself must also accept his other. If you are in one, your certainty about the one excludes the other. But how can you then reach the other? If we are ready to recognize the claim of the other in us, we can cross over into the other, since the other has become conscious to us. All right, so there's a lot here. So he who wants to accept himself must also accept the other, right? So in order for him to accept the above, he has to also accept the below. And this is the thing that's difficult for Jung to do. God is not just the highest and most grand, it's also the lowest and the contaminated. And it's the unity. It's all of it. You can't parse off the parts you don't like, Jung. Can't do that. And so his vision is trying to get him around to accepting this. He says, if you are in one, your certainty about the one excludes the other. And what he means here is he continues to talk about the other as God, but it being indistinct from him or from you and I, right? It's all a oneness. So if you are in one, meaning if you are in the normal, sober state of mind that we're all in right now, you don't recognize yourself as God. If you are God, you don't recognize yourself as an individual. It's right. If you're in one, you're certain I am Chris, then I know that I'm not God. Or if I'm in that unity position and I'm certain that I am the divine totality, I'm not going to say, oh, and I'm also Chris. So it's like, the word he used earlier was there's a dissociation here. And where does that come from, right? Well, it comes from ego. It comes from this sense of being a self, of being an I, this sense of being Chris. Ego prevents you from knowing your true self. And it says, but how then can you reach the other? And then he answers, if you're ready to recognize the claim of the other in us, if you're ready to recognize that you are in fact one with God, always have been and always will be, then you can cross over to the other, since the other has become conscious to us. And this ability to encounter God, of crossing over, I want you to see the connection there is consciousness. That's the path that allows you to recognize, right? If you're conscious in God and God is conscious in you, you have this link that allows you to encounter God or to recognize God in you. And then it winds down in this beautiful way. I couldn't leave it out. I love it. It says the depths are silent. Okay, and I'll stop there just to say that the book, the visions, oftentimes include commentary by a spirit, and it's called the spirit of the depths. Okay, and here it says the depths are silent. It's like nothing more to be said. It says he has arisen and now beholds the light of the sun and is among the living. Amen. It is finished. What was unreal is real. What was real is unreal. This is the Good Friday when we complete the Christ in us and we descend to hell ourselves. Oh man. So this whole thing where he says the depths are silent and it is finished, I think those are synonymous phrases, right? But it is finished, again, will remind you of the gospel narrative when Jesus is just about to die on the cross. He says exactly this: it is finished. So it says he has arisen and now beholds the light of the sun and is among the living. So God has been brought into us and is made real and alive through us. And then he says this amazing paradoxical thing, which again, you'll recognize we're talking about God here in this very paradoxical way, which I predicted and told you would happen. He says, what is unreal is real, and what is real is unreal. What is God is man, and what is man is God. Something like that, right? The unconscious is the thing. God is the thing. Spirit is the thing that we say is not physically real. That doesn't mean it doesn't have a reality or influence. It just means it's not here and now. It's not subject to physics. It's not made of matter. We can't interact with it physically. All of that, right? That's what we mean by real. And he's saying the unreal is real. Spirit is real, right? That thing that we can't touch or taste or scientifically test is as real as the things that we can. And this is the Good Friday when we complete the Christ in us and descend to hell ourselves, right? Boy, to connect ourselves to that aspect of reality that is the divine, that is spirit, to descend into the underworld. And it says this: who is it that descends from being one into being two? Who is it that tore apart his own heart to unite what has been separated? Okay, well, I'll ask you to answer that question. He's going to answer it next, but what do you think he means? Who is it that descends from being one into being two, right? God is the oneness, and the creation, you and I and everybody else, we are the manyness, right? Who starts off being one and becomes many, right? There's an ancient Egyptian hymn. It is about Atum, I think, and he's called He Who Made Himself into Millions. This is the idea, right? God is that which became the cosmos and the consciousness and life within that cosmos. This is what he's saying. Who is it that descends from being one into being two? Who is it that tore apart his own heart to unite what has been separated? And he answers, I am he, the nameless one, who does not know himself and whose name is concealed even from himself. In that I abased myself. I elevated myself as another. In that I accepted myself. I divided myself into two. And in that I united myself with myself. I became the smaller part of myself. I am this in my consciousness. Precisely because of my smallness, I can be conscious of the nearness of the great. And before I get to my conclusion, I just want to repeat this line. I became the smaller part of myself. And I want you to understand what that means. Right now, we believe that, again, all those things I rattled off to you earlier, the way our face looks, the way our voice sounds, our ideas, our preferences, our memories, all of this stuff, the ego, we think of as ourself, 100%. There's nothing in that description left out. This is what I am. And he said, in this vision, no. You realize that is only the smaller part of yourself. That ego, that thing that you think you are, is only one tiny fraction of the thing you really are. That cosmic unity, that thing we call God. And that brings me to my conclusion. These visions are particularly interesting to me because they deal with Jung's own psychological dissonance between his belief in the centrality of spirit or psyche and the contemporary scientific stance that religious ideas are reducible to superstition or that they're psychological cope against things like death anxiety. Even beyond this, we begin to see Jung's genuine grappling with his own Christianity. And more than ever in the Red Book, these visions are filled with allusions to Christian myth and doctrine. Sure, there's a facade hanging from them, but even so, we see things like an original state of unity with the divine, the transformational eating of flesh, and even the necessity of sin and salvation. Now, strikingly, it is Jung's interpretation of the meaning of the Christian story where we see his most personal and unique ideas. A prime example occurs when Jung presents us with the idea of a state of ultimate unity, an original oneness with God, which must strangely be broken. And we have a parallel in the Bible where the first man walks with God in paradise before losing it all. The natural question is, why did it have to be so? Why was the fall necessary in the first place? What is the myth trying to tell us? Now, without going into apologetics here or delving into free will, suffice it to say, Christian theology hinges upon the fall as a precondition for ultimate salvation. No fall, no need for redemption, right? So it must be so. And Jung agrees, but not for the reasons of the theologians. They would talk about God's plan of salvation or about fulfilling prophecy, but Jung understands it differently. He has different hermeneutics. In these visions, we see the fall when Jung's soul tells him to abase himself, to destroy the image of the God's formation, to commit cannibalism. He's being drawn to sin by his own soul, pulled towards a fall. But the fall for Jung is not the act of disobedience depicted in Genesis. It's something else. Now, a reminder of the context is probably helpful. So remember, the visions preceding these culminated in Jung coming to realize that the individual, that himself, and God are not distinct beings, but something more like two halves of a whole. A transcendent part, God, and an immanent part, us, or Jung himself in this case. Those visions reveal that somehow, paradoxically, we are responsible for God's existence in the same way God is presented as responsible for ours. But these new visions tell him he must restore his human life, that we must pull away from unity with God in order to once again be ourselves. We must fall. He calls this separation, quote, an act of the below. You might ask, why? But if closeness to God is holiness, as we would say, then intentionally separating yourself from God must be the opposite, right? And the vision tells Jung to, quote, withdraw his life force, which dissociates from the God. But this fall, the vision tells us, occurs for the salvation of the soul. But how? And here is where we get to Jung's hermeneutics. Recall in the first vision when Jung learns that, quote, God wants my life. He wants to go with me, sit at the table with me, work with me. Above all, he wants to be ever present. These ideas parallel the insistence of Jesus in the Gospels that, quote, not my will, but yours be done, and complement his declaration that, quote, I and the Father are one. In both cases, we imagine God being present in us, living in us, and acting through us. There's a merging of identity. God exists not only transcendently, but simultaneously he exists immanently in us. God is creator and creation. And this is where we hit at the heart of it, and where Jung's interpretation of Scripture veers from orthodoxy. The Orthodox message is that the fall was necessary so that God could reconcile the world to himself. Jung, on the other hand, suggests that the fall was necessary so that the unconscious, a euphemism for God, can be made conscious. We fall from God so that we may become conscious of God. We separate ourselves from a unified identity and fall into an ego, a self. As a self, distinct from everything else, we can finally encounter God, since he is now apart from us. He is now my other, as Jung put it. Salvation, it seems, surrounds making the unconscious conscious, or in biblical parlance, making the word flesh. Jung concludes, quote, we can cross over into the other, since the other has become conscious to us. So consciousness, you see, is the link between the material and the divine.
Well, there you have it. That's one avenue explored, but infinitely more still to go. I hope you enjoyed thinking along with us. I know. It's not easy work. Thinking. It's hard and full of uncertainties, but I'm grateful for the company as we trek through this together. Here's to hoping that the juice is worth the squeeze. See what I did there? Let's find out together in the next episode.